The lawns at Gossington Hall were at their prettiest in the hour after tea, when the shadows of the elm trees lay like lace on velvet and the rose beds threw up a last fresh breath before evening. Mrs. Bantry liked to think it all reflected very well on her, and had the habit, as she moved among the stalls, of glancing back to check that the effect remained pleasing. The summer fete for the parish hospital fund was her idea, and if she had chosen to augment the usual cakes and bric-a-brac with something altogether more theatrical, that too reflected very well on her enterprise. She had secured, through a gentleman at the golf club who knew someone in Bath, the loan of a Tudor 4-poster bed with carved posts and faded blue hangings, said to have sheltered a prince escaping through a window long before any of them were born. The bed had been set up in the blue chamber, the guest room on the first floor, and those who bought an extra ticket were invited to queue on the stairs and take a peep. It all sounded perfectly harmless, which was precisely why it felt faintly daring. Miss Jane Marple paid for nothing more than a jar of Mrs. Pym's marmalade and stood a little to the side with it cradled in her thin hands. She had been placed by good fortune and old habit under one of the elms, exactly where she could watch without seeming to. Her lace mitts were not new, and she made a small business of adjusting them when she wished to look longer than was polite. It had been a warm day, and men's collars were unfastening themselves while women's hats were changing hands on the pretext of admiration. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Hart, the doctor's wife, smiled too brightly at Mrs. Pym and looked down at her lace as if it were fascinating. She observed that Lionel Wickham, who kept the Hare and Plover on the High Street, had a stain on his cuff that looked suspiciously like port and a large flower in his buttonhole that did not suit him. Most particularly, she noticed Miss Lydia Vale. Lydia was the sort of girl village people decided to call a young lady because it made them feel both generous and older than they were. She had been in St. Mary Mead only a fortnight, visiting her aunt, Mrs. Evans of the post office, and she had managed, by no effort of her own, to be noticed immediately. She was very fair, with pale gold hair pinned in a coronet, and had a mouth that looked perpetually as if she were keeping back a retort. At the moment she was smiling, her head tilted as she listened to Lionel Wickham in a manner that put him in excellent spirits. A small teardrop pearl hung from her ear and trembled as she laughed. When Miss Marple looked at Lydia's hands, she saw that the right one played idly with the ribbon of her reticule, while the left lay still, fingers pressed together, as people do when they are keeping themselves from saying something they ought not. Mr. Oswald Brabazon, who had brought the bed, was a large man who went in for good cloth badly cut and had his hair arranged as if for the stage. He had arrived with a younger man who did the lifting and returned to the railway van at once, but Mr. Brabazon had stayed, talking loudly of the bed's provenance and the difficulty of navigating narrow staircases with honest antique furniture. He laughed in the large way men do when they wish to sweep along the reservations of others, and had a habit of swiping his hand over his chin that made one anticipate whiskers, which were not, in fact, there. When the afternoon turned warmer still and the air on the lawn felt as if it had been used already, Mrs. Bantry proposed that those with tickets for the Blue Chamber might as well go up in small parties and see the celebrated bed rather than melt where they stood. It would be cooler on the landing, she said. And besides, she confessed in a stage whisper to Miss Pym, it would look so well in the newspaper with a stair rail full of people. Miss Marple did not intend to go up at once. She thought, with mild amusement, that she had seen beds before. She watched the first group ascending, Mrs. Pym among them, substantially outpacing her escort in her anxiety to be first. The afternoon began to shake itself into a new pattern as people who had never climbed stairs in company found they enjoyed it. There were exclamations from above that floated down the stairwell like ribbons. The carving, my dear. And it must weigh a ton. And somebody laughed, Lionel Wickham again, who seemed to be everywhere, saying loudly that there was life in it yet. The word life drifted down and, misunderstood by two schoolgirls at the foot of the stairs, came back as a giggled whisper that the bed breathed. The thing once said has a way of arriving everywhere at once. By the third party up, people were saying it as a joke, and by the fifth, it had become a little game. Someone would always push the jest a little further, and soon visitors were ascending with the delicious anticipation of seeing something not quite natural. Miss Marple waited, as people at fate always lost things and always blamed the wrong person. When she finally made her way to the house, she found Dora, Mrs. Bantry's housemaid, stationed on the landing with a strained little face and quick eyes that stored everything she observed without malice. Dora confided that Mr. Brabazon had insisted on fixing the bed curtains himself, with a screwdriver and such, miss, like a man that has reasons. She had seen him stand inside the canopy, drawing the blue fabric across and peering at where it met as if something depended upon it. The sensation grew stronger as the afternoon progressed. Each group that descended the stairs carried with them an air of pleasant misbehavior and whispered confirmations that, yes, indeed, the bed did seem to breathe. The heavy blue curtains stirred with a regularity that seemed almost like respiration, though there was scarcely a breeze to account for it. What had begun as a schoolgirl's fancy was becoming something altogether more unsettling. It was nearly 6 o'clock when the commotion began. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself where she could observe the flow of visitors, noticed that Miss Lydia Vale had not been seen for some time. Mrs. Evans came hurrying with the look women wear when their answer to "Where is Lydia?" has become, "I do not know." The girl's small grey reticule was discovered on the landing table, abandoned beneath a lithograph of a lady with lilies. Then Dora, forgetting herself in her alarm, pulled back the blue bed curtains that everyone had been so carefully warned not to touch. The fabric parted with a whisper, and the afternoon's gentle mystery became something else entirely. There, lying as if arranged for a portrait, was Miss Lydia Vale. Her pale hair was unpinned, the plait lying like rope beside her, and one small pearl earring was missing. Her hands were folded on her breast in an attitude that would have been almost peaceful, if it had not been so certainly final. The bed, it seemed, had stopped breathing, but the mystery of what had made it appear to do so was only just beginning. For a moment that stretched like held breath, the landing held only the soft collective recoil of people confronting the unthinkable. Then Mrs. Bantry's voice cut through the paralysis, crisp with the authority that comes from years of managing crises, both social and domestic. She dispatched Dora for Dr. Hart, with instructions that brooked no delay, while directing the remaining visitors downstairs with the firm kindness of a hostess who would not permit her guests to witness more than was proper. Miss Marple remained where circumstances had placed her, near enough to observe but sufficiently unobtrusive to be overlooked. She had noticed in that first terrible glimpse before the curtains fell closed again that Miss Vale's hands had been arranged with deliberate care. The positioning was too precise for the randomness of natural death, too peaceful for the violence that might explain a young woman's sudden end. More telling still was the missing pearl earring and the tiny bruise on the exposed lobe that suggested it had not simply fallen away. Dr. Hart arrived with the measured haste of a man accustomed to emergencies, though perhaps not of this particular nature. His examination was thorough but swift, conducted with the professional detachment that allowed him to see past the tragedy to the medical facts beneath. When he emerged from the blue chamber, his expression carried the gravity of confirmed suspicions. He spoke quietly to Mrs. Bantry, but Miss Marple, positioned near the hall table where she appeared to be examining a china shepherdess, caught the essential words. No obvious cause, no signs of violence, but the circumstances were decidedly irregular. Young P.C. Williams arrived within the quarter hour, his bicycle abandoned on the front drive in his haste. He was a well-meaning man who took his duties seriously, though his experience had been limited to matters of stolen chickens and the occasional domestic dispute. The sight of the Tudor bed with its ominous curtains clearly overwhelmed him, and he fumbled for his notebook with the earnest confusion of someone following procedures he had memorized but never practiced. The small crowd that had gathered in the hall below seemed to divide itself naturally between those who pressed forward, hungry for details, and those who stepped back as if distance might protect them from unpleasant possibilities. Mrs. Pym belonged firmly to the first category, her eyes bright with the sort of interest that would later be called unseemly, but was really nothing more than human curiosity sharpened by shock. Lionel Wickham, however, had grown quite pale and kept running his hand through his hair in a gesture that spoke of genuine distress. Mr. Brabazon presented the most curious study of all. He stood near the front door as if calculating the distance to his motor car, yet seemed unable to actually depart. When P.C. Williams questioned him about the bed's installation, he answered readily enough, explaining how he had personally supervised the arrangement of the curtains and tested their stability. His voice carried the confidence of professional expertise, but Miss Marple observed that his hands remained clenched throughout the conversation, and a fine perspiration had appeared on his brow, despite the cooling evening air. The mystery of the breathing bed had been solved, though in the most disturbing manner possible. Dr. Hart explained to the constable that Miss Vale's final moments, spent behind those blue curtains, would have caused the fabric to stir with each shallow breath. The thought that the afternoon's visitors had been unknowingly observing a death scene cast a pall over everyone present that no amount of rational explanation could lift. Mrs. Evans, poor woman, had been helped to one of Mrs. Bantry's chairs, where she sat wringing her hands and repeating fragments of the morning's ordinary details. Lydia had seemed perfectly well at breakfast, had remarked on the fine weather, had chosen her dress with particular care for the fete. Through her distress, however, other details emerged. Lydia's recent restlessness, her frequent walks to the post office, her habit of standing at the window as if watching for someone. Miss Marple found herself thinking of the girl's nervous hands as she had observed them earlier, the way one had played with her reticule ribbon while the other remained pressed and still. When she quietly examined the grey reticule that had been left on the landing table, she discovered two things of interest. The clasp was slightly bent, as if it had been handled roughly, and folded small inside lay a railway ticket to Bath, dated for the following morning. As evening shadows lengthened across Gossington Hall's lawns, the abandoned fete stalls stood like monuments to interrupted pleasure. Death had rearranged everything around it, transforming a social gathering into something altogether more sinister. Each person present would now need to account for their movements and their relationship to poor Miss Vale. And Miss Marple suspected that the girl's brief fortnight in St. Mary Mead had been more eventful than anyone had realized. By evening, when the last of the fete visitors had been questioned and dismissed, Gossington Hall had taken on the hushed quality that settles over houses where death has called unexpectedly. Mrs. Bantry moved through her rooms with the careful precision of someone conscious that every action would later be examined and discussed, while Dora kept to the servants' hall, her usual cheerful chatter replaced by the wide-eyed silence of someone who had seen too much. P.C. Williams had done his best with notebook and pencil, recording names and times with the earnest determination of a man following procedures he hoped were adequate. The blue chamber remained sealed, its door bearing the sort of official notice that transformed a guest room into something altogether more ominous. Dr. Hart had completed his preliminary examination and departed with the grave expression physicians wear when they cannot yet speak with certainty, leaving behind only the promise that proper arrangements would be made in the morning. Miss Marple had accepted Mrs. Bantry's invitation to stay for a simple supper, though neither woman showed much inclination toward food. Instead, they sat in the morning room with untouched plates before them, speaking in the careful way people do when tragedy has made ordinary conversation seem inadequate. It was during this quiet interval that Dora appeared at the door, her cap slightly askew and her hands twisted in her apron. She had been tidying the landing, she explained, trying to restore some semblance of normalcy to the upper floor, when she had discovered something that troubled her. Near the skirting board at the foot of the service stairs, half hidden beneath the carpet's edge, lay a small metallic object that glinted in the lamplight. Miss Marple examined it with the careful attention she might have given a pressed flower, turning it between her fingers while her mild blue eyes grew thoughtful. It was the threaded screw from an earring back, the sort used to secure a pearl or stone snugly against the earlobe. The tiny piece of jewelry hardware told a story more eloquent than any witness statement. It suggested not accidental loss, but forceful removal, the kind that occurred during struggle or haste. When Miss Marple recalled the missing pearl earring and the small bruise she had observed on Miss Vale's exposed lobe, the significance became unmistakable. The railway ticket to Bath had already raised questions about the girl's intentions, but this discovery suggested something more complex than a simple planned departure. Someone had been with Miss Vale during her final moments. Someone who had reason to remove her jewelry with such force that the delicate mechanism had broken and fallen unnoticed to the floor. Inspector Slack arrived with the morning light, bringing with him the brisk efficiency that had made his reputation throughout the county. He was a man who approached mysteries as problems to be solved rather than puzzles to be savored. And his first act was to establish a proper cordon around the blue chamber while arranging for the body to be removed to the cottage hospital for thorough examination. His interview with Mr. Brabazon proved particularly illuminating. The antique dealer had spent a restless night at the Hare and Plover, and his earlier joviality had given way to a nervous precision that made every answer sound rehearsed. He explained again about the bed's installation, the testing of the curtains, his concern for the proper display of a valuable piece. When Inspector Slack questioned him more closely about the curtain mechanism, Brabazon's hands began to shake slightly as he demonstrated the internal cord system that allowed someone inside the canopy to draw the hangings closed. It was during this demonstration that the second railway ticket came to light. P.C. Williams, conducting a methodical search of the blue chamber under the inspector's supervision, discovered it wedged behind the carved headboard where it might have fallen from nervous fingers. Like the first ticket, it was bound for Bath on the morning train, but this one bore no name and appeared to have been purchased quite recently from the booking office at Much Benham Station. The implications struck everyone present with uncomfortable force. Miss Vale had not been planning to travel alone, and whoever had intended to accompany her had taken considerable care to conceal their connection to her departure. The anonymous ticket suggested clandestine arrangements, secret meetings, the sort of elaborate planning that spoke of more than casual acquaintance. Lionel Wickham's reaction to this discovery was immediate and telling. The publican, who had been hovering near the hall with the transparent excuse of delivering fresh flowers from his wife, turned quite pale when Inspector Slack mentioned the second ticket. His protestations came in a rush. Surely many people travelled to Bath. Market days were always busy. One could hardly draw conclusions from such common coincidence. His explanations struck Miss Marple as the sort of elaborate justifications people offered when simple ones would not suffice. The village, meanwhile, had begun to weave its own theories around the tragedy. Mrs. Pym, established at her usual post behind the post office counter, dispensed speculation with the same authority she applied to stamps and postal orders. Young women who visited unknown relatives, she declared, usually had reasons that bore examination. The fact that Miss Vale had received several forwarded letters during her brief stay only added fuel to the growing conviction that romance, probably of the unsuitable variety, lay at the heart of the matter. Miss Marple listened to these theories with the patient attention she gave to all human observations, storing each detail in the careful mental filing system that had served her so well over the years. The bent clasp on the reticule, the missing pearl earring, the broken screw mechanism, the anonymous railway ticket. Each was a small domestic fact, unremarkable in itself, but potentially significant when viewed as part of a larger pattern. As the morning progressed and Inspector Slack's investigation gained momentum, it became clear that Miss Vale's brief fortnight in St. Mary Mead had been more eventful than anyone had initially realized. The girl who had seemed so quietly decorative at the fete had apparently been living a double life. one that involved secret correspondence, clandestine meetings, and carefully planned departures. The question that remained was whether she had been the architect of her own tragedy, or merely its unfortunate victim. The bed that had breathed so mysteriously during the afternoon's entertainment now stood silent and accusatory, its blue curtains drawn back to reveal the scene where a young life had ended. But the mystery it had concealed was proving far more complex than anyone had imagined. And Miss Marple suspected that before Inspector Slack finished unraveling its threads, several carefully guarded village secrets would be exposed to the unforgiving light of official scrutiny. The morning brought Inspector Slack to the post office with the methodical determination of a man who believed that mysteries, like accounts, could be balanced through proper attention to detail. The small shop carried its usual atmosphere of string and sealing wax, though Mrs. Evans moved through her duties with the careful precision of someone conscious that grief made every gesture subject to scrutiny. Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to inquire about a parcel of knitting wool that seemed determined to remain lost in transit, found herself positioned where she could observe the official proceedings without appearing to do so. Mrs. Brick. Evans' revelations came reluctantly, extracted through Inspector Slack's patient questioning like water from a reluctant well. Yes, Lydia had received correspondence during her brief stay, 3 letters in all that she had collected with particular eagerness. 2 had been forwarded from her previous lodgings in Weston-super-Mare, but the 3rd had arrived directly from Bath, written on cream paper with a black border that struck Mrs. Evans as oddly old-fashioned for a young person's correspondence. The girl had guarded these letters carefully, reading them in private and keeping them about her person rather than leaving them in her room. More intriguing still was Mrs. Evans's hesitant admission that a gentleman had once inquired about Miss Vale's correspondence. He had appeared at the post office counter 3 days prior, asking in the most polite terms whether any letters had arrived for the young lady. When properly refused according to postal regulations, he had accepted the denial with good grace, though Mrs. Evans recalled that he had worn a signet ring and possessed the sort of trained speaking voice that suggested education and social position. His manner had been entirely respectable, yet something about the inquiry had left her with a vague sense of unease. The description, while frustratingly vague, added another layer to the mystery surrounding Miss Vale's final days. Inspector Slack noted it with the thoroughness that marked his approach, though he observed privately to Miss Marple that signet rings were common enough among gentlemen of a certain class, and trained voices could belong to anyone from a schoolmaster to a commercial traveler with social aspirations. The investigation's next phase took them to the Hare and Plover, where Lionel Wickham awaited them with the sort of eager cooperation that immediately aroused suspicion. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, were steadier than they had been the previous day, though small crescents of dirt beneath his fingernails suggested recent activity that had little to do with his usual duties behind the bar. When Inspector Slack pressed him about his relationship with Miss Vale, the publican's composure began to crack with almost audible precision. The confession, when it came, arrived in a rush of words that seemed to surprise Wickham himself. Yes, he had known Miss Vale beyond the casual acquaintance appropriate to a village publican and a visitor. They had met for walks along the river, exchanged notes of the sort that married men ought not write to young ladies, and he had been foolish enough to purchase the second railway ticket to Bath in a moment of romantic impulse. The elopement had been more fantasy than serious plan, he insisted, a middle-aged man's foolish dream of escaping the comfortable tedium of village life. He had never intended to actually board that train, and he certainly had not harmed Miss Vale when she perhaps took his romantic gestures more seriously than he had intended. Inspector Slack received this confession with satisfaction that bordered on relief. Here was motive, opportunity, and the sort of domestic entanglement that explained mysterious railway tickets and secret meetings. The missing pearl earring could easily have been torn away during a confrontation when Miss Vale discovered that her supposed lover had no intention of honoring his romantic promises. The case was taking shape with the clarity that made for tidy reports and satisfied superiors. Miss Marple, however, found herself troubled by inconsistencies that seemed to multiply rather than resolve as more facts emerged. Wickham's distress appeared genuine, and his confession to the affair carried the ring of truth, yet something about his account failed to satisfy her growing sense that the obvious solution might not be the correct one. She recalled his behavior at the fete. The way his hands had trembled when Inspector Slack mentioned the bed's curtain mechanism, and the genuine shock in his expression when Miss Vale's body had been discovered. The village, meanwhile, had begun to settle into the comfortable rhythm of scandal digested and theories confirmed. Mrs. Pym, established behind her counter with the authority of someone who had predicted disaster from the beginning, dispensed judgment along with stamps and postal orders. It was all very sad, she declared to anyone who would listen, but entirely predictable when married men of a certain age allowed themselves to be turned by pretty faces, romantic nonsense. Poor Mrs. Wickham would bear the shame, of course, though perhaps she was better off knowing the truth about her husband's character. The atmosphere of satisfied conclusion that began to settle over St. Mary Mead struck Miss Marple as premature. She found herself thinking of the careful arrangement of Miss Vale's hands in death, the precision with which her body had been positioned, and the missing pearl earring that suggested deliberate removal rather than violent struggle. The bent clasp on the reticule, the anonymous railway ticket, the mysterious gentleman with the signet ring, each detail seemed to point toward a more complex truth than Wickham's confession could explain. As Inspector Slack prepared to formalize his case against the publican, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous comfort of obvious solutions. In her experience, the human heart was rarely as straightforward as official investigations preferred to believe, and the most carefully constructed facades often concealed the deepest deceptions. The bed that had breathed so mysteriously during the afternoon's entertainment had given up its immediate secret, but she suspected that the true mystery of Miss Vale's death lay buried beneath layers of misdirection that had yet to be fully explored. The first suspect had presented himself with obliging clarity, complete with motive and opportunity neatly wrapped in romantic scandal. That very convenience, Miss Marple thought as she made her way home through the village lanes, might prove to be his most compelling argument for innocence. While Inspector Slack spent the morning consolidating his case against Lionel Wickham with the satisfaction of a man whose theories had been confirmed by convenient confession, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to Gossington Hall by questions that refused to settle into comfortable answers. She had requested permission to examine the blue chamber once more, ostensibly to ease a small anxiety about the curtain arrangements, and Inspector Slack had granted it with the indulgent air of someone humoring an elderly lady's nervous concerns. The room, stripped of its tragic occupant and sealed for official purposes, held secrets that became apparent only under careful scrutiny. Miss Marple moved to the window first, noting that the freshly dusted sill bore 2 tiny flecks of blue fabric, as if something had rubbed against it repeatedly. The sash was firmly latched, confirming that the windows had remained closed during the fete, just as Mr. Brabazon had insisted. Near the bed's footpost, she discovered a small brass eye that had been screwed into the wood at an unusually low position, its surrounding varnish noticeably paler than the aged patina elsewhere. Most telling of all was the faint, dark line that ran across the carpet from the bed to the corner, where the pile showed signs of recent compression and uneven recovery. The mark suggested that a narrow cord had lain there and been pulled away, leaving behind the sort of evidence that only someone familiar with domestic details would notice. When she conducted a small experiment later that evening with a shawl in the draught beneath her own parlor door, the fabric merely lifted and fell still. It did not breathe with a rhythmic motion that had so captivated the fete visitors. Dr. Hart's preliminary findings, shared during a professional consultation about Mrs. Evans' nerves, cast the entire investigation in a different light. Miss Vale had died from what appeared to be respiratory failure, but her body showed no signs of violence, struggle, or forced restraint. The positioning of her limbs suggested that death had come peacefully, perhaps even during natural sleep. This revelation made Wickham's confession of violent confrontation seem increasingly implausible, though it explained his genuine distress at being connected to the girl's death. A visit to Mrs. Evans, ostensibly to help arrange Lydia's personal effects, yielded discoveries that further complicated the simple elopement narrative. Among the girl's possessions, Miss Marple found a much-thumbed program from the Theatre Royal in Bath, with a single initial written in firm, tight handwriting beside a date 3 days before the fete. The paper carried the faint but unmistakable scent of stage cosmetics, and tucked within was an appointment card from a milliner in Argyle Buildings, scheduled for the morning after the fete. Most intriguingly, the blotter revealed the impressed fragment of an address ending in Crescent and the beginning of a name that could be Edward or Edmund. The social significance of the black-bordered cream paper that had carried Lydia's final letter from Bath became apparent during casual conversation with Mrs. Evans about modern stationery fashions. Such formal morning paper was rarely used by young people for ordinary correspondence, suggesting either a bereavement or someone of older, more traditional habits. Combined with Mrs. Evans' description of the mysterious gentleman with the signet ring and trained voice, the letter pointed toward connections that had nothing to do with romantic elopement. Mr. Brabazon's unexpected visit to Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon provided the most revealing evidence yet. He had come, he claimed, to express concern about his antique bed's reputation, but his knowledge of the investigation's details seemed remarkably comprehensive for someone with merely professional interest. His questions about the police findings carried an urgency that went beyond commercial concern, and when Miss Marple mentioned the mysterious post office inquirer, his reaction was immediate and telling: a slight flush, a momentary hesitation, and an overly casual dismissal that confirmed rather than dispelled suspicion. The signet ring on Brabazon's finger matched Mrs. Evans' description perfectly, and his cultivated speaking voice would certainly qualify as trained to a village postmistress. His detailed knowledge of village gossip, his personal supervision of the bed's installation with particular attention to the curtain mechanism, and his presence at the fete all provided opportunities that Inspector Slack's investigation had not fully explored. The missing pearl earring took on new significance when viewed as a deliberate souvenir rather than evidence of struggle, particularly for someone with Brabazon's professional appreciation of valuable objects. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous comfort of obvious solutions. Wickham's confession had provided exactly the sort of domestic scandal that satisfied both official requirements and village expectations. But the physical evidence suggested a more sophisticated deception. The bed that had breathed so mysteriously had been rigged with mechanical precision by someone who understood both theatrical effect and human psychology. The careful arrangement of Miss Vale's body, the timing of the discovery, and the theatrical precision of the entire scene bore the hallmarks of someone with artistic sensibility and practical experience in creating impressive displays. The obvious suspect had indeed emerged with convenient clarity, complete with motive and romantic entanglement, but Miss Marple suspected that this very convenience might prove to be his strongest argument for innocence. The true mystery lay not in middle-aged folly, but in the careful orchestration of events by someone whose connection to Miss Vale was more complex than village gossip could imagine. The morning brought Inspector Slack to Gossington Hall with the practical intention of allowing Mr. Brabazon to dismantle his Tudor bed under official supervision. Mrs. Bantry, eager to restore her blue chamber to its former tranquil purpose, had pressed for the arrangement with the sort of determined hospitality that brooked no resistance. Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to return a borrowed recipe book, positioned herself near the window where she could observe the proceedings with the mild interest of someone watching a moderately engaging domestic procedure. Brabazon approached the dismantling with the careful precision of a man handling valuable property, though Miss Marple noted that his usual theatrical confidence seemed somewhat diminished in the morning light. When he began work on the carved cornice at the bed's head, a coil of thin waxed cord slipped from its concealment and would have fallen to the floor had he not caught it with surprising quickness. His explanation about preventing damage to antique mechanisms sounded perfectly reasonable, yet Miss Marple recalled the faint dark line she had observed on the carpet the previous day, precisely where such a cord might have lain. The blue curtains, when finally removed, revealed traces that told their own story. A fine pale powder clung to the inner hems, quite different from ordinary household dust. When Miss Marple remarked innocently that old furnishings collected the most curious residues, Brabazon agreed with excessive enthusiasm and launched into an elaborate discourse on the preservation challenges facing antique textiles. His knowledge was undoubtedly genuine, but his nervous energy suggested that the topic held more significance than mere professional interest. Dr. Hart's arrival, summoned by Mrs. Bantry to advise on whether the room might be safely aired, provided the morning's most crucial revelation. His post-mortem examination had yielded findings that cast the entire investigation in a different light. Miss Vale had died from respiratory failure, but her body showed no signs of violence, struggle, or physical restraint. The peaceful positioning of her limbs suggested that death had come quietly, perhaps even during natural sleep. This medical certainty made Wickham's confession of violent confrontation seem not merely implausible, but impossible. More significantly, Dr. Hart had conducted a more thorough inquiry into Miss Vale's medical history. Mrs. Evans, when pressed with gentle persistence, had revealed that her niece suffered from severe respiratory sensitivity, particularly to feathers and certain types of dust. The girl carried a small blue bottle of sal volatile and had recently begun using a modern inhalant purchased from a Bath chemist. The bottle was notably absent from her personal effects, and Mrs. Evans recalled that Lydia had been forced to avoid feather pillows entirely during her stay. The Tudor bed's original mattress, as Dora now revealed with guilty reluctance, was stuffed with ancient down that had never been properly beaten or aired. Brabazon had specifically forbidden any disturbance of the bedding, insisting that such interference would damage the historical authenticity of the display. His instruction that old dust was part of the romance took on sinister implications when viewed alongside Miss Vale's medical vulnerability and the careful staging of her final moments behind the breathing curtains. A telegram from Bath, delivered by an excited messenger boy who sensed the importance of his mission, provided the next piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple had dispatched a carefully worded inquiry to the milliner in Argyle Buildings, and the response confirmed that Miss Vale's appointment had been for a position interview, not a fitting. More tellingly, the milliner acknowledged that an Brabazon had telephoned to alter the appointment time, demonstrating a level of involvement in the girl's affairs that went far beyond casual acquaintance. When confronted with this evidence, Brabazon's cultivated composure began to show hairline cracks. He denied any connection to Bath milliners with the sort of elaborate precision that suggested careful preparation, but his signet ring caught the light as he gestured, and Miss Marple noted that the heraldic device matched perfectly the impression she had observed on the black-bordered letter among Miss Vale's effects. His offer to waive his fee for the bed's loan struck Inspector Slack as suspiciously generous, particularly given the circumstances. The afternoon brought Mrs. Hart to Miss Marple's cottage with information gleaned from her sister's Bath connections. A respectable widow who took in theatrical lodgers had immediately recognized Miss Vale's description and confirmed that she had been a frequent visitor over recent months, always accompanied by a gentleman who paid for her accommodation and showed proprietary interest in her welfare. The landlady's assumption that they were father and daughter had been based on the man's protective behavior rather than any physical resemblance, and his description matched Brabazon in every significant detail. This revelation transformed the entire narrative from romantic elopement to something far more complex and disturbing. The bath appointments, the theatrical connections, the careful financial arrangements, all suggested a relationship that had nothing to do with village romance and everything to do with a more sophisticated form of exploitation. The missing inhalant bottle took on new significance when viewed as evidence that someone had deliberately removed the very medication that might have saved Miss Vale's life. A visit to the Hare and Plover, conducted under the pretext of arranging a church committee meeting, provided the final confirmation of Wickham's innocence. The publican appeared genuinely tormented by his situation, his earlier nervousness replaced by the hollow resignation of a man accepting undeserved punishment. His wife, moving through the establishment with careful dignity, offered insights that crystallized Miss Marple's growing certainty about her husband's true character. Lionel enjoyed romantic fantasies. She explained with weary wisdom, but lacked the resolve for serious action. His confession represented misguided chivalry rather than genuine guilt. Most revealing was Wickham's reaction when Miss Marple mentioned Brabazon's planned departure for Bath. His expression showed genuine puzzlement rather than the relief or concern that might be expected from a guilty man learning of his victim's associates' movements. His questions carried the innocent curiosity of someone with no particular connection to the antique dealer beyond their brief fate encounter. The discovery of a pearl earring in Wickham's office drawer, initially hailed by Inspector Slack as conclusive evidence, proved instead to be the final proof of his innocence. The earring retained its screwback, making it impossible to be the one that had left broken fragments on the service stairs. The planted evidence suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the investigation's progress and access to Wickham's premises during the busy afternoon hours when the public house received deliveries. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the elaborate deception that had been constructed around Miss Vale's death. The bed that had breathed so mysteriously had been rigged with mechanical precision by someone who understood both theatrical effect and human psychology. The careful arrangement of the girl's body, the timing of the discovery, and the theatrical precision of the entire scene bore the hallmarks of someone with artistic sensibility and professional experience in creating impressive displays. The obvious suspect had indeed emerged with convenient clarity, complete with romantic motive and physical evidence, but Miss Marple suspected that this very convenience represented Wickham's strongest argument for innocence. The true mystery lay in understanding why Brabazon had chosen to stage Miss Vale's death so publicly and dramatically, and what secrets from their Bath connection had made such elaborate measures necessary. The breathing bed had given up its immediate mystery, but the human heart that had orchestrated its deception remained as carefully guarded as ever. Inspector Slack began the following morning with the methodical determination of a man whose theories required only final confirmation. Miss Marple's observation about the earring screws had planted an uncomfortable seed of doubt, but he approached Mr. Brabazon's hired van with the professional thoroughness that had earned his reputation throughout the county. The vehicle, parked behind the Hare and Plover and prepared for departure, carried the mingled scents of camphor, varnish, and old textiles that spoke of its owner's trade. Brabazon welcomed the inspection with an eagerness that struck Miss Marple as slightly too pronounced for a man with nothing to conceal. His explanations flowed with the practiced smoothness of someone who had prepared for exactly these questions, detailing the necessity of protective wrappings and the challenges of transporting delicate antiques through country roads. When P.C. Williams lifted a folded drugget to reveal a neat spool of thin waxed cord beneath, Brabazon's discourse on curtain security mechanisms came perhaps a shade too quickly. More intriguing was the small tin of violet-scented powder that nestled among the packing materials, its French script speaking of theatrical rather than domestic purposes. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself where she could observe without appearing to do so, noticed the brown paper wadding tucked behind a wooden brace. The paper bore the telltale ring where a bottle stopper had rested, and when she lifted it delicately to examine the torn chemist's label, the faint medicinal breath of menthol and eucalyptus confirmed her growing suspicions about Miss Vale's missing inhalant. The morning's discoveries took on greater significance when Mrs. Evans arrived at the post office to find evidence of nocturnal interference. The small locked box where she had preserved Lydia's correspondence had been forced open with something narrow and precise, leaving scratches on the paint that spoke of practiced skill. The black-bordered letter from Bath, which she had been reluctant to surrender to official scrutiny, had vanished along with any other documents that might have illuminated her niece's true circumstances. The window at the post office's rear showed signs of careful manipulation, and on the flagstones outside lay a single smudge of dried mud bearing the distinctive pointed impression of a town-made sole. A baker's boy, questioned about his early morning rounds, remembered a narrow-shouldered figure standing by the shutters with a sort of careful stillness that made honest folk hurry past without meeting his eyes. The man's hair had possessed the unnatural shine that came from pomade, and his posture suggested someone accustomed to avoiding attention while conducting questionable business. Dora's recollections, when properly encouraged, provided the sort of domestic detail that no official investigation could anticipate. The young man who had assisted with the bed's installation possessed a small healed cut along his jaw, badly shaved around, and had shown curious interest in the service stair's location. More tellingly, he carried the faint but unmistakable scent of spirit gum, which Dora recognized from her cousin's theatrical work at Weston Pier. During the morning's heavy lifting, she had heard him address Brabazon as uncle in an unguarded moment, though neither man had acknowledged the slip. When Miss Marple remarked innocently to Brabazon that old beds proved troublesome for people with respiratory sensitivities, his response revealed more than he intended. His initial claim that the mattress contained horsehair rather than down came too quickly, followed by an elaborate correction about mixed stuffing and Tudor replacements that sounded more like prepared lecture than casual conversation. The nervous energy behind his expertise suggested someone whose knowledge served purposes beyond mere professional interest. The afternoon brought a development that transformed speculation into certainty. Mrs. Evans discovered a plain envelope pushed beneath the post office door, containing a single pearl earring without its screwback, and a small card bearing the message, "Keep her name out of Bath," in tight, slanted handwriting. The pearl matched Lydia's remaining earring perfectly, but its surface carried traces of the same pale violet dust that had clung to the bed curtains, creating an unmistakable connection between the missing jewelry and the theatrical powder found in Brabazon's van. The handwriting itself told its own story to someone familiar with the social correspondence of 7 decades. The compressed letters and ornamental capitals suggested someone accustomed to making his signature appear impressive on documents, while the finishing strokes spoke of practice in formal penmanship that served professional rather than personal purposes. The threat contained within those carefully formed words shifted the investigation's focus from village romance to something far more calculated and dangerous. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the dangerous sophistication of the deception that had been constructed around Miss Vale's death. The bed that had breathed so mysteriously during the fete had been merely the visible portion of an elaborate mechanism designed to create both spectacle and misdirection. The true mystery lay not in understanding how the girl had died, but in comprehending why someone had taken such elaborate pains to ensure that her death appeared both natural and public, while simultaneously preparing an innocent scapegoat to bear the consequences of a crime far more complex than village gossip could imagine. The morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage with the sort of professional courtesy that masked considerable frustration. The pearl earring and threatening note had complicated his case against Wickham in ways that required delicate handling, particularly since the handwriting bore no resemblance to the publican's familiar scrawl. He found Miss Marple in her garden, engaged in the apparently innocent task of deadheading roses, while maintaining perfect sight lines to the lane where Mr. Brabazon's van remained conspicuously parked. The threatening note, when examined more carefully in proper light, revealed secrets that transformed speculation into certainty. The paper carried a watermark that spoke of quality stationery rather than common writing materials, and beneath the careful penmanship lay the faint impression of previous writing pressed through from an overlying sheet. The ghostly traces revealed theatrical terminology and London addresses, suggesting that what had appeared to be deliberately disguised handwriting was actually someone's natural commercial script, trained for impressive presentation on documents and contracts. A visit to the railway station at Much Benham, conducted under the pretext of inquiring about delayed parcels, yielded information that cast the entire conspiracy in sharper focus. The station master recalled Brabazon's arrival 3 days before the fete, accompanied by a younger man whose clothes showed careful mending and whose hands bore the telltale stains of stage makeup. The assistant had carried a small leather case of the type used by traveling performers, and when it had briefly opened during luggage handling, the station master had glimpsed theatrical properties including false whiskers and small bottles of various preparations. The afternoon brought discoveries that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about Edmund's panicked attempts to cover his tracks. P.C. Williams, following reports from the fishmonger's boy about a narrow-shouldered fellow cutting across the allotments, found a neat bundle beneath the canal footbridge. Inside lay theatre bills from Bath, cheap false whiskers still tacky with spirit gum, and most significantly, a small blue bottle with its glass pipette broken off cleanly. Dr. Hart's examination revealed that the inhalant had been emptied and refilled with mild camphorated oil, harmless for soothing colds, but useless during respiratory distress. The post office showed fresh evidence of Edmund's increasingly desperate attempts at concealment. The back door bore new marks where a blade had been worked with patient care, and a twist of oily rag had been thrust under the threshold and fired, only to gutter out for want of draught. Mrs. Evans had smelled something acrid and extinguished it with calm efficiency, but near the coal scuttle lay a small dented tin containing traces of the same violet powder that had clung to the bed curtains and the pearl earring. News from Bath, arriving through Mrs. Hart's sister's connections, provided the final pieces of the puzzle surrounding Lydia's true circumstances. Among the girl's remaining effects, Mrs. Evans had discovered a notebook containing rehearsal schedules and character notes with references to Uncle E and the Bath engagement that suggested professional rather than familial relationships. A pressed forget-me-not flower bore an inscription in the same tight handwriting as the threatening note. "Remember your obligations, my dear." Words that spoke of coercion rather than affection. The black-bordered correspondence that had so puzzled Mrs. Evans proved to have originated from a solicitor in Royal Crescent, managing affairs for a recent widow whose household had been disturbed by whispers. A companion had been dismissed with unusual abruptness after a scene involving a gentleman who paid bills without signing checks, whose descriptions matched Brabazon in every significant detail. The theatrical connections painted a picture of exploitation disguised as patronage, with Lydia trapped in arrangements that had followed her from Bath to what she had hoped would be sanctuary in St. Mary Mead. As evening approached, Mrs. Barpesite Bantry organized a small afternoon gathering, ostensibly to discuss rescheduling the hospital fund's next event, but primarily to create an atmosphere of determined normality. Mr. Brabazon, still lingering in the village, was invited to finalize arrangements for returning the Tudor bed, which now stood dismantled in the Gossington Hall stables, its grandeur reduced to mere planks and carvings. Miss Marple found herself seated beside Brabazon with a cup of weak tea, the setting sun casting long shadows across the patterned carpet. He spoke at length about antique dealing and the regrettable tendency of people to misinterpret carefully curated historical displays, but she noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he raised his teacup and the way his eyes darted nervously toward the doorway. "It is such a pity," Miss Marple began, her voice soft and conversational, "that poor Miss Vale should have chosen such a public place for her final moments. One might almost say it was rather theatrical. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Brabazon? All those people watching, quite unknowingly, a little drama unfold." Brabazon's fixed professional smile wavered slightly. "Indeed, Miss Marple, a most unfortunate coincidence. My only concern was for the integrity of the antique, a priceless piece of history." He dabbed at his brow with a silk handkerchief, though the room was not particularly warm. "Oh, but the illusion was quite complete, wasn't it?" Miss Marple continued, her gaze fixed on a distant rose in the garden. The breathing bed, such a clever touch. It quite captured the imagination. One almost wondered if it was a deliberate effect, designed to draw attention to something hidden within. One might even say a performance almost too perfectly staged to be entirely accidental. A muscle twitched in Brabazon's jaw, and his gaze fixed on Miss Marple with an intensity that belied his casual posture. "Staged? My dear Miss Marple, I assure you the only staging I concern myself with is the proper display of period furniture." "Perhaps not life itself," Miss Marple conceded gently. "But sometimes people can be arranged quite deliberately, especially when they have secrets to protect. Secrets connected to reputations that must be kept out of certain towns. Bath, for example, with its many theatrical connections and respectable widows who employ young companions." The effect was immediate and profound. Brabazon's complexion drained of color, his hand clenched into a fist, and the signet ring dug into his flesh. His eyes flickered with raw, desperate fear as he stammered an attempt at denial, but the words caught in his throat. "A theatrical troupe in Bath," he managed, his voice barely a whisper, the practiced confidence finally cracking. "I assure you, my business is strictly antiques." Miss Marple merely nodded, taking a delicate sip of her tea. One often finds that the most carefully constructed facades hide the most surprising truths, especially when there are financial considerations or family obligations tying one to certain arrangements. The mention of family obligations struck him like a physical blow. He recoiled slightly, his face a mask of dawning horror, and Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that she had found her answer. The breathing bed, the public spectacle, the carefully manufactured scandal around Wickham, all had been elaborate theatrical flourishes designed to conceal a far more sordid truth. Brabazon had staged a death not merely to silence Lydia Vale, but to protect a reputation and secret life that she had threatened to expose. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken revelations, and Miss Marple reflected that vanity, as she had long observed, was often the thread that, when pulled gently enough, would unravel even the most carefully woven deception. The silence that followed Miss Marple's gentle observation about family obligations stretched like a held breath, each second weighted with the accumulated pressure of 3 days' careful investigation. Brabazon's teacup rattled against its saucer as he set it down, his theatrical composure finally beginning to crack under the persistent kindness of her attention. The afternoon light slanted through Mrs. Bantry's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the growing darkness in his expression. "You speak in riddles, Miss Marple," he managed, though his voice carried none of its former authority. "I fear my simple antique dealer's mind cannot follow such complex theories about theatrical arrangements." Miss Marple adjusted her lace mitts with deliberate care, her mild blue eyes never leaving his face. "Oh, but I think you understand perfectly, Mr. Brabazon. The breathing bed was such a clever theatrical effect, wasn't it? All those people watching quite unknowingly as poor Miss Vale struggled behind those blue curtains." One might almost say the timing was too perfect to be entirely accidental. The effect was immediate and devastating. Brabazon's carefully maintained facade began to crumble, revealing beneath it a man whose desperation had driven him to elaborate deception. His hands gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles showed white, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. The bed did not breathe naturally. Miss Marple continued with gentle precision. It was made to breathe. The small brass eyes screwed into the footpost at that unusually low position, the fine waxed cord running across the carpet to the corner. I noticed the compressed pile where it had lain. A simple mechanism, really, operated by someone who understood theatrical effects. The curtains moved with such regularity because they were being manipulated, creating the illusion that drew everyone's attention to what was happening inside. Inspector Slack, who had been observing from the doorway, stepped forward with the measured authority of a man whose patience with village mysteries was wearing thin. Mr. Brabazon, I believe it's time you explained your relationship with Miss Vale and the precise circumstances surrounding that bed's installation. The confession, when it came, emerged in broken fragments, each admission torn from Brabazon like a physical wound. Edmund was indeed his nephew, his sister's boy, left to his care when she died in circumstances that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge. The theatrical connections in Bath, the careful cultivation of relationships with wealthy widows seeking entertainment, all had been constructed to provide Edmund with the social position his talent deserved, but his birth denied him. Lydia recognized Edmund from their shared Bath circles. Brabazon whispered, his voice growing stronger as the relief of truth overcame his initial terror. She understood the true nature of our arrangement, how we had presented ourselves to Mrs. Whitmore's household. Edmund had genuine theatrical ability, you see, and the old woman had grown genuinely fond of him. She had even mentioned him in her will, a small bequest that would have secured his future. Miss Marple nodded with the patient understanding she had always shown toward human weakness. But Miss Vale threatened to expose the deception. She wanted money, didn't she? Not a great deal, just enough to establish herself independently. When she followed you here to St. Mary Mead, claiming to visit relatives, you knew her demands would become more pressing. The Tudor bed had provided what Brabazon had initially conceived as mere intimidation. His knowledge of Lydia's respiratory sensitivity, gleaned from Edmund's casual observations about her frequent use of inhalants, had suggested a way to frighten her into abandoning her blackmail attempts. The breathing curtains would create an atmosphere of unease, while the ancient down-filled mattress would trigger her breathing difficulties. I never intended for her to die, he insisted, though his eyes avoided Miss Marple's gentle gaze. Edmund was to replace her inhalant with harmless camphorated oil. We found the empty bottle later, refilled with something useless. She was meant to be uncomfortable, dependent on our goodwill, frightened into leaving the village quietly. The plan had gone catastrophically wrong when Lydia's respiratory distress proved more severe than anticipated. The combination of the feather-stuffed mattress, the enclosed space behind the curtains, and the absence of effective medication had triggered a fatal attack. By the time Brabazon realized the true extent of her distress, it was too late to save her without revealing his own involvement. The pearl earring, Miss Marple observed quietly, was removed deliberately, wasn't it? Not torn away in struggle, but taken as evidence of your power to reach her anywhere. The broken screw mechanism we found on the service stairs told its own story about forceful removal. The elaborate staging that followed had represented desperate improvisation rather than calculated murder. The careful arrangement of Lydia's body, the timing of the discovery, and the preparation of Wickham as a convenient scapegoat had been hastily constructed to transform accidental death into apparent natural causes with romantic complications. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his notebook ready. And your nephew, Mr. Brabazon, his role in the subsequent cover-up? Edmund knew nothing of the final arrangements. Brabazon said quickly, his concern for his nephew overriding his own desperate circumstances. He believed we had merely frightened her into leaving early. The railway ticket to Bath was genuine. She was meant to depart in disgrace, not in death. When he learned what had really happened, he panicked. The break-in at the post office, the planted evidence in Wickham's office, that was Edmund's misguided attempt to protect me. Miss Marple listened to these revelations with the patient attention she had always given to human confessions, storing each detail in the mental framework that had guided her understanding from the beginning. The breathing bed, the missing inhalant, the planted evidence, each element had served multiple purposes in a deception that grew more elaborate as its architect realized the magnitude of his miscalculation. The violet powder on the curtains and the pearl earring, she inquired gently. Was that another theatrical touch? A misdirection, Brabazon admitted. I thought if the death seemed connected to stage life, to a world of loose morals and questionable associations, it would be easier to accept. The powder was from Edmund's theatrical supplies. We used it to coat the earring before sending it with a threatening note. The afternoon shadows had lengthened considerably during this confession, and through the drawing-room windows, the abandoned fete stalls stood like monuments to interrupted pleasure. The breathing bed had given up all its secrets, revealing not just the mechanism of death, but the human desperation that had orchestrated its elaborate deception. I think, Mr. Brabazon, Miss Marple said quietly, that you should prepare yourself to repeat this conversation under rather more formal circumstances. The bed that breathes so mysteriously has told us its complete story at last, and I'm afraid that story must now be heard by those whose duty it is to see that justice is properly served. Brabazon nodded with the weary resignation of a man whose elaborate performance had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The village mystery that had begun with a garden party's innocent entertainment had revealed the dangerous lengths to which human vanity and desperation could drive even the most carefully constructed respectability. In trying to protect one deception, he had created a tragedy that no amount of theatrical skill could disguise or undo. Inspector Slack did not immediately reach for his handcuffs, though the weight of official duty pressed heavily upon the afternoon's genteel atmosphere. He requested the use of Mrs. Bantry's library, dispatched P.C. Williams to quietly locate Edmund, and asked Dr. Ten Hart to remain for the formal proceedings that would inevitably follow. Miss Marple settled herself by the window where the fading light fell kindly across her knitting bag, though her needles remained tucked away as she observed the final act of a tragedy that had begun with such innocent entertainment. Brabazon sat with the rigid posture of a man whose elaborate performance had finally reached its conclusion. His signet ring, turned inward on his finger as if its heraldic device had become an accusation, caught the light as he began his confession with the weary precision of someone past all pretense. The breathing bed, he explained, had been designed as theatrical intimidation rather than murder weapon. The brass eyes screwed into the footpost, the waxed cord running beneath the carpet, the gentle manipulation that made the curtains stir with such regular rhythm, all had been calculated to create unease, while drawing attention at precisely the moment when Lydia's absence would be discovered. Edmund's arrival brought with it the purposeful caution of someone determined to appear innocent despite circumstances that made such appearances impossible. The healing cut along his jaw looked angrier in the afternoon light, and traces of spirit gum still clung near his ear like evidence of hastily abandoned disguises. His gaze moved between his uncle and Miss Marple, seeking perhaps the sort of mercy that elderly ladies sometimes granted to imprudent young men, but finding instead only the steady attention that offered no shelter from approaching consequences. The complete story emerged in fragments, each admission adding weight to the growing understanding of how desperate circumstances had driven respectable people toward elaborate deception. Edmund had emptied Lydia's inhalant bottle the evening before the fete, placing its life-saving contents with harmless camphorated oil. He had accidentally dropped the earring screw mechanism during his hasty removal of the pearl, which was later sent with a threatening note as evidence of their reach. His panic-driven break-in at the post office, his attempt to destroy incriminating correspondence, and his planting of evidence in Wickham's office had all been misguided efforts to protect the uncle whose theatrical ambitions had shaped his entire understanding of right and wrong. "You see," Miss Marple observed gently as the confession concluded, "how often people are encouraged toward the story they would rather believe. It is comfortable to blame romantic folly, because then one need not consider cruelty, only ordinary human weakness." Dr. Hart's medical testimony provided the final pieces of understanding. Death had come from acute respiratory failure, triggered by exposure to the ancient downfilling and exacerbated by the absence of effective medication. The enclosed space behind the breathing curtains, the deliberately latched windows, and the theatrical timing had combined to create circumstances that made rescue impossible, even when Dora's frightened discovery revealed the carefully arranged tableau. The formal arrest proceeded with quiet efficiency that transformed Mrs. Bantry's drawing room into something resembling a courtroom. Brabazon accompanied the constables with resigned dignity, pausing only to request proper legal representation for his nephew. The village watched from behind curtains and garden gates as handcuffs glinted in the afternoon sun, marking the end of a mystery that had begun with innocent curiosity about a breathing bed. Edmund's capture required coordination between local constabulary and their Bath counterparts, as the young man had fled to the theatrical lodgings where he felt most secure. His distinctive appearance and nervous behavior made him conspicuous among professional performers who understood the art of blending seamlessly into any crowd. When finally apprehended, he broke down completely, confirming his uncle's account while revealing the genuine affection and misplaced loyalty that had driven his desperate attempts at concealment. Lionel Wickham's release from suspicion brought mixed emotions to both his household and the village at large. His confession to romantic entanglement with Miss Vale had been genuine enough, though his middle-aged fantasies had never progressed beyond stolen meetings and foolish correspondence. The revelation that he had been deliberately chosen as a scapegoat because of his obvious vulnerability struck his wife as both insulting and oddly reassuring. At least she now understood the true extent of her husband's capacity for actual mischief. The legal proceedings that followed provided the village with months of discussion material, though the trials proved less dramatic than local speculation had anticipated. Brabazon's defense of manslaughter rather than premeditated murder was accepted by a jury that recognized the difference between criminal negligence and deliberate killing, though his sentence reflected the court's disapproval of elaborate deceptions that endangered vulnerable people. Edmund received lighter punishment in recognition of his youth and secondary role, though the scandal effectively ended any hopes for a legitimate theatrical career. Mrs. Evans faced the melancholy task of settling Lydia's modest affairs, discovering in the process that the girl had possessed more substance than her brief village appearance had suggested. Among her belongings were sketches and writings that revealed artistic ambitions beyond mere performance, making her death seem not just tragic, but wasteful of genuine potential. The small bequest she left to a Bath charity for struggling performers created a modest memorial to dreams that circumstances had prevented her from pursuing honestly. The Tudor bed, dismantled and returned to its proper owners, left behind questions about the responsibility of those who lend historical artifacts without proper consideration of their potential misuse. Mrs. Bantry declared herself permanently cured of ambitious entertainment schemes, though Miss Marple suspected that time would restore her natural inclination toward impressive social arrangements. The Blue Chamber was eventually redecorated with cheerful chintz and modern furniture, though guests occasionally remarked on an inexplicable sense of unease that seemed to linger near the windows where tragedy had once been staged. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead and the events of the summer fete began to fade into local legend, the village gradually resumed its normal rhythms. The hospital fund eventually reached its target through more conventional means, and Mrs. Bantry's future entertainments would feature no borrowed antiques or mysterious breathing effects. The lesson that theatrical ambitions could prove dangerous when applied to real life had been learned at considerable cost to all concerned. Miss Marple reflected on the case during her evening walks through the village lanes, observing how quickly human nature reasserted its usual patterns after even the most disturbing interruptions. The breathing bed had revealed not just the mechanics of death, but the complex web of relationships that bound people together in ways both protective and destructive. Brabazon's desperate attempt to shield his nephew from the consequences of their deception had ultimately destroyed them both, while Wickham's foolish romantic fantasies had made him vulnerable to manipulation by more calculating minds. The pearl earring eventually returned to Mrs. Evans as a memento of her niece's brief but eventful visit, served as a reminder that even the smallest domestic details could prove significant when viewed by someone trained to notice the patterns that others overlooked. The mystery of the bed that breathed had taught its final lesson about the dangerous consequences of allowing vanity and desperation to override moral consideration, and Miss Marple suspected that St. Mary Mead would be some time before it again welcomed such elaborate entertainment into its peaceful routines. In the end, she reflected, the human heart remained as complex and treacherous as ever, capable of both great kindness and profound cruelty, often within the same individual. The bed that had breathed so mysteriously during the afternoon's innocent entertainment had concealed not supernatural forces, but the very human capacity for elaborate self-deception, all in service of preserving carefully constructed illusions that could not ultimately withstand the patient scrutiny of truth. The Christmas season brought its own gentle rhythms to St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the events of the summer fete as she arranged holly branches in her sitting room. The village had settled back into its familiar patterns with the remarkable resilience that small communities display when confronted with tragedy, though certain changes remained visible to those who knew where to look. Mrs. Bantry had indeed abandoned her ambitious entertainment schemes in favor of simple tea parties, while the Hare and Plover had acquired a subdued atmosphere that spoke of lessons learned about the dangers of middle-aged romantic folly. The legal proceedings had concluded with sentences that satisfied the requirements of justice while acknowledging the complex motivations that had driven ordinary people toward extraordinary deception. Brabazon's conviction for manslaughter had surprised no one, though his dignified acceptance of responsibility had earned grudging respect from those who had initially seen only calculated villainy. His genuine concern for Edmund's welfare, even in the face of his own disgrace, had revealed depths of character that his theatrical pretensions had previously concealed. The judge's remarks about the particular cruelty of exploiting a young woman's medical vulnerability had resonated throughout the courtroom, ensuring that the sentence reflected society's disapproval of such calculated manipulation. Edmund's lighter sentence reflected both his secondary role and his youth, though the scandal had effectively ended any hopes for legitimate theatrical success. The young man had written to Miss Marple from prison, a letter that mixed genuine remorse with a sort of dramatic self-reproach that suggested his theatrical instincts remained intact despite changed circumstances. His plans for honest employment upon release struck her as more hopeful than his previous ambitions, though she suspected that the stage would always hold dangerous attractions for someone of his temperament. The Bath theatrical community had quietly closed ranks against him, making clear that certain forms of notoriety were incompatible with professional respectability. Mrs. Evans had gradually emerged from her grief to resume her postal duties with renewed appreciation for the ordinary rhythms of village life. The small memorial garden she had created behind the post office, planted with forget-me-nots and sweet peas, provided a peaceful reminder of her niece's brief but eventful visit. The discovery among Lydia's effects of genuine artistic talent had transformed the girl's memory from cautionary tale to tragedy of wasted potential, lending dignity to what might otherwise have been merely sordid. The sketches and poems found among her belongings revealed a sensitivity that made her exploitation seem all the more heinous. The breathing bed itself had passed into local legend with a sort of embellishment that transformed actual events into cautionary folklore. Children dared each other to walk past Gossington Hall's blue chamber window, now cheerfully redecorated but still carrying whispers of its brief notoriety. The mechanical explanation for the curtain's mysterious movement had satisfied adult curiosity, without entirely dispelling the sense that some mysteries contained depths that rational explanation could not fully illuminate. Mrs. Bantry had donated the bed's dismantled pieces to a museum, declaring herself permanently cured of the desire to house historical artifacts with questionable associations. Lionel Wickham had emerged from his ordeal with his marriage intact, but his romantic illusions permanently cured. His wife's practical acceptance of his foolishness, combined with her evident relief that his capacity for actual mischief proved so limited, had created a new understanding between them that struck Miss Marple as probably healthier than their previous arrangements. The publican's genuine distress at being used as an unwitting scapegoat had revealed character strength that his earlier bluster had concealed. His testimony during the trial, delivered with painful honesty about his middle-aged folly, had actually enhanced his standing in the community rather than diminishing it. Dr. Hart's medical findings had provided the scientific framework that transformed speculation into legal certainty, though Miss Marple reflected that the true mystery had always been psychological rather than medical. The combination of respiratory sensitivity, deliberate medication substitution, and environmental triggers had created circumstances that made death inevitable once the elaborate deception was set in motion. The tragedy lay not in the method, but in the casual cruelty that had treated a vulnerable young woman as merely an obstacle to be removed, rather than a human being deserving of protection and compassion. Inspector Slack had received commendation for his handling of the case, though he privately acknowledged to Miss Marple that her observations about domestic details had proved more valuable than his official procedures. The earring screw mechanism, the compressed carpet pile, the theatrical powder on the curtains. Each small discovery had contributed to understanding that no amount of formal interrogation could have achieved. His respect for village wisdom had increased considerably, though he remained skeptical about amateur detection in general. The case had taught him that the most elaborate crimes often revealed themselves through the accumulation of tiny domestic inconsistencies rather than dramatic confrontations. As winter settled over the countryside and the events of the summer fete faded into memory, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the dangerous appeal of theatrical solutions to ordinary problems. Brabazon's elaborate staging of tragedy, his careful manipulation of evidence and witnesses, his confident assumption that complex deception could triumph over simple truth, all had reflected the sort of vanity that mistook cleverness for wisdom. The breathing bed had been merely the visible symbol of a mentality that treated human life as material for dramatic effect, reducing real people to supporting players in a performance designed to preserve carefully constructed illusions. The pearl earring, returned to Mrs. Evans as a memento of her niece's visit, had found its way into the memorial garden where it caught the winter light among the dormant forget-me-nots. The small piece of jewelry served as a reminder that even the most carefully planned deceptions eventually revealed themselves through accumulated details that no amount of theatrical skill could entirely control. The broken screw mechanism, the violet powder, the compressed carpet, each had told its own small story that contributed to the larger truth about human nature's capacity for both creativity and cruelty. Miss Marple's final reflection on the case concerned the nature of observation itself, and the difference between watching for entertainment and watching for understanding. The fate visitors who had unknowingly observed Lydia's final moments had been seeking pleasant diversion, while the true observers, Herself, Dr. Hart, even young Dora, with her housemaid's eye for domestic irregularities, had been guided by deeper currents of human sympathy and professional responsibility. The lesson, she thought, applied far beyond the boundaries of criminal investigation to the broader question of how people chose to see and understand each other in daily life. In the end, she reflected as she settled into her chair with her evening knitting, the mystery had revealed not supernatural forces, but the very human capacity for self-deception in service of carefully constructed illusions. The breathing bed had concealed a tragedy of wasted potential and misguided loyalty, wrapped in the sort of theatrical pretension that mistook complexity for sophistication. Truth, as always, had proved simpler and more devastating than the elaborate fictions designed to conceal it, requiring only patient attention to the small domestic details that revealed the human heart in all its contradictory complexity. The village had survived its encounter with elaborate deception, though not without scars that would influence future choices about entertainment and trust. Miss Marple suspected that St. Mary Mead's next charitable fete would feature nothing more exotic than a coconut shy, and perhaps a modest raffle. The community having learned through bitter experience that some forms of excitement carried prices too high to be willingly paid again. The bed that had breathed so mysteriously during that summer afternoon had taught its final lesson about the dangerous consequences of allowing vanity and desperation to override moral consideration. And she was confident that the village would remember that lesson long after the details of the case had faded into comfortable legend.